I'm Saruti.
And welcome to Red-Handed and the Jungle.
Uh-oh. Please tell everybody the fun fact that you learned last week.
So I learned that there is going to be a film about Jonestown, starring Leonardo DiCaprio as
Obviously
Jim Jones.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I've been speaking to loads of people about who they would cast as Jim Jones. And I think the best option, I wanted Ray Fiennes,
Mm-hmm.
but Robin Williams would have fucking killed it.
I think Ray Fiennes just is not chonky enough.
But, I mean, look at the Penguin. They can chonk him.
This is true.
They can chonk him.
This is true.
And in his younger life, Jim Jones was quite svelte.
Oh.
It's just when he gets on the fucking speed, he blows up like a whale. But what I learned is that the director who is on the Jonestown film project is most famous for his direction of the Jack Black edition of Jumanji, which is called Welcome to the Jungle.
Full circle. Da, 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 da.
I read that in an article and I was like, you'd just leave that one out, wouldn't you?
They didn't even make a point of it.
No, not at all. It's
Missed
known
opportunity.
for blah, blah, and blah, blah, and blah, blah, and Welcome to the Jungle. My jaw was on the fucking floor. And I was like, am I the only person reading this with my mouth agape?
Absolute missed opportunity. Sack that person. But it is good because we can talk about it here.
We
And
most certainly can.
no plagiarism because they didn't make that joke.
No, and we also have a chapter on cults in the book where Jonestown is heavily featured. So if there are similarities between this and the chapter in our book, it's because the true in true crime means it happened. So sometimes it is impossible to completely stray. And also that's a book that we wrote and it nearly fucking killed me. So we can lean on that as much as we want, in my opinion. Anyway, over our lives of being true crime interested people and also doing this show for as long as we have discovered that being obsessed with true crime can get you some funny looks, knowing exactly why Lorena Bobbitt cut her husband's dick off and threw it in a field and secretly rooting for her might not be accepted with open arms in polite company. But cults are different. Everyone, everywhere finds cults absolutely fascinating. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And cult leaders are often the central narrative when it comes to cult stories, cult episodes, cult content. But at Red-Handed, we're much more interested in the cult members themselves. And I understand why the cult leader storyline is the one that's told over and over again. Firstly, it's a lot easier to follow one person's story. And when you come to cults, especially like Children of God or Jonestown, where there are thousands of other people, it's really hard because you can't tell all of those stories. As a storyteller, as a writer, following one person's trajectory is more easy, right? It's simpler. But I think you're missing the point when you do that.
Yeah. I remember talking about this, years and years ago when we did that very first Halloween story swap and we were talking about Robin Gett from the Chicago Ripper Crew. And the reason that cult leader idea is so compelling is that, this idea that one person goes out and does evil shit, it's not a surprise to anybody, let alone people who are interested in true crime. It's that fascination with this idea that one person can skew the reality of so many other people and drive them to commit acts that had they not met that person, they possibly never would have done. And I think that's the real interesting part for me and you, definitely, when it comes to cults. And I think we also talked about this, don't know, whichever cult we talked about, but the idea of why do cult leaders do it, right? And typically it's because, and it's not that interesting, really, when you dig down. The reason they do it in most cases is because they want to normalize their own perverse ideas, right? If you look at something like the Children of God cult, it was David Berg within that who wanted to rape children. And in a society that tells you, rightfully, that that is wrong and abhorrent and you're a monster, Let me then create my own personal sanctuary, quote unquote, in which I have convinced everybody and twisted and deformed everybody's reality to the point that that is now acceptable. And now I'm no longer a monster because we're all doing it. That's, I think, at the heart of the cult leader. But you're right. The cult devotees are far more interesting.
Totally. I mean, you can see a narcissist every time you turn on the fucking news. Like, it's really not... We can do better, is what I'm trying to argue. And I think that we're so obsessed with dedicants because the central narrative, well, the literal definition of cult members is that they hold ideologies that the greater public, like you and me, deem subversive and even disgusting. But those ideologies that we cannot fathom are so fastly held by cult devotees that they drive previously normal people to do unthinkable things. And it really does not get more unthinkable than what the followers of a Karl Marx-obsessed reverend did to themselves, their own children, and a solitary chimpanzee down in Guyana on the 18th of November 1978. Killing another person is an act so abhorrent that all of you listening, I really, really hope, can't get your head around it. But the Reverend Jim Jones is a whole world above that. Like Charles Manson, he never killed anyone except possibly himself. More on that next week. But he did convince almost 1,000 people to kill each other.
I mean, that one sentence alone is why this story has remained in the true crime consciousness for as long as it has. It is unbelievable. So for the cult kingpin to be able to manipulate swathes of people using only their charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent to do the unspeakable is the ultimate thrill and absolutely gives them an unmatched level of power. If we talk about individual serial killers who want to exert power and dominance over one other person that they kill one at a time, what could be more that on steroids? Steroids even, that on fucking crack, than convincing 1,000 people to do it at the same time. The ability to command people who without their influence would never have raised a hand to anyone, let alone their own child, is the ultimate ego trip. And that is the thing that quite a few people who aren't recreational duvet detectives like you all listening don't realize. No one knowingly joins a cult. The reason that cults even exist in the first place is one of the key pillars of the human experience, the desire to belong. Belonging is the most important and at times the most frustratingly elusive aspect of being alive. Without a tribe, living can be unbearable. So to try and get ahead of the pendulous feeling of emptiness, we join groups, political parties, knitting clubs, netball teams, churches, soundbath circles. We could go on, but you get the picture. Homo sapiens are not built to be alone.
The feeling of being a part of something bigger than yourself is unparalleled. And we look for meaning wherever we physically and psychologically can. And unfortunately, that search for a higher purpose that plagues our entire species can make us very susceptible to the influence of someone who claims to have the answers, be they a pauper, a priest, or a president. Along the red-handed journey, we have learned that all cult leaders have one thing in common. They all claim not only to have the explanation for why we're all so fucking miserable all the time, they know how to fix it. And all you have to do to gain access to the Ark of the Existence Covenant is to hand over your faith, all your money, your identity, and quite a lot of the time, your life.
No such thing as a free lunch.
That's what I should have called this episode.
Enter the jungle, no free lunch. Unless it's laced with cyanide.
Another knowledge bomb that we've got for you is that usually cult leaders, Jim Jones absolutely included, display manifestations of narcissistic personality disorder. The DSM-5 lists 9 traits associated with NPD, and lots of people have narcissistic traits, but to be whacked with a proper NPD diagnosis, a person needs to display at least 5 of the following. a grandiose sense of self-importance, a preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. A deep-seated belief that they are special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high-status people or institutions. A desperate need for excessive admiration, a significant sense of entitlement, exhibit interpersonally exploitative behavior, display a lack of empathy, they're envious, or they really, really believe that others are envious of them, and also possessing arrogant or haughty behaviors and attitudes. And having told you that, we are sure, I would bet big money, that by the end of this 2-part series on Jonestown, you will agree that Jim Jones has every single one of the things I just said. The Reverend Jim Jones, the architect and tyrannical director of the People's Temple, and the greatest intentional loss of American lives before 9/11, has every single one of the narcissistic traits that the DSM-5 notates.
The story of the Jonestown jungle settlement and how it got off the ground is the perfect illustration of how good, intelligent people who want to be the change they see in the world can end up dead in deadly cults. The People's Temple was born in the Jim Crow South, armed with an ideology of equality and love for your fellow man, no matter their colour. A white man enthusiastically preaching that people of colour should be treated as equals in Indiana was as radical as it got in the 60s. So many Americans were disillusioned with segregation and racial oppression. And Jim Jones struck at exactly the right time. The winds of change were a-blowing in the South, and he was ready to blow right back at them with his homily of equality and how socialism was going to solve everything. Later in life, Jim Jones claimed that he never held the Christian God sacred. He had just used the familiar framework of the Holy Trinity to introduce his flock to the wonders of a life lived together, for each other, through very radical utopian socialism. But how did he get there? Don't panic, we're going to tell you.
James Warren Jones was born in 1931 in Crete, Indiana, a place that boasted a whopping 28-person population. Can you even call that a hamlet?
I mean, is that a house?
Yes.
Is that a household?
And he didn't stay there for long. When he was slightly less newborn, his parents moved to the only very slightly larger town of Lynn. And the Joneses were dirt poor. We're talking no running water poor. And there was a litany of other problems as well. Jones's father's respiratory system had been ravaged by mustard gas in World War I, which meant that most days he could barely speak. He drank to cope and wasn't able to work too much either. And also in that particular area, time, blah, 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 a lot of work that was available to men was either construction or mining. And you can't do any of those if you can't breathe. However, Mr. Jones Sr. was well liked in the little town of Lynn. He always made sure to greet the neighbourhood children by name as they ran past his porch, which was something that other grown-ups never bothered with. Jones's other parent, Lynetta, was a different story. She worked around the clock through the Great Depression to keep her family afloat, but also gave not a single shit about what anyone thought about her. She was foul-mouthed, she smoked in public, and most unforgivably of all, she wore trousers. Unbelievable. If you've spent any time looking into cult stuff, cult leaders, cult capers, you will have noticed that cult leaders never have a normal relationship with their mother. And Jim Jones is exactly the same story. Lynetta really thought that her son could do no wrong. So much so that when little Jim would go around all of the local shops nicking chocolate bars on the reg, she would just go to all of the shops once a week and pay for what her son had pinched. Little Jimmy was her industrious and clever hero. She'd absolutely no boundaries when it came to her boy, which again, take a look at David Berg. That shit breeds cult leaders. So you will see in quite a few places that Jim Jones's lack of parental support and affection as a child was one of the reasons he went on to be what he ended up being. And that is true, but I don't think it's a lack of affection. I think it's being adored in a very problematic way by one of his parents. But she worked all the time, so he also did spend a lot of time on his wands. Until his neighbour, who's called Myrtle, noticed this lone boy kicking around on his Todd all the time, and she took him under her very pious, angelic wing. Unlike Lynetta Jones, everyone in Lynn really liked Myrtle, even though she would stop people in the street and ask them why she hadn't seen them at church recently. But that was her only sin, which in a place like Lynn was really not that bad. Wearing trousers and smoking was way, way worse.
And baby Jim Jones welcomed this adult attention, and given Myrtle's commitment to the Lamb of God, their relationship went in a pretty predictable direction. Myrtle, which means evergreen shrub, was an evergreen schlub for Yahweh, and she imprinted that upon the childhood of Jim Jones. She read him the Bible any chance she got, and Jim took to it like a duck to water. Myrtle was overjoyed with her pint-sized apostle, and she and Jim Jones stayed in touch for decades. In no time at all, Jim started giving sermons of his own to anyone who would listen, and sometimes even when there was no one listening at all. And he attended every church that the town of Lynn had to offer. Denominational difference was immaterial to him. Jim Jones was hooked on God and knew exactly what he wanted to be, and he just couldn't wait to grow up for that to happen. Off consecrated ground, little Jim cranked it up a notch and started to play God instead. And he did that by killing stray animals and holding funerals for them.
Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah.
Jones would make kids younger than him attend his ghoulish game because kids his own age wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. And that was probably because when all of them played war in the playground at school, instead of wanting to be an Allied soldier like everybody else, Jim Jones always wanted to be Hitler.
So all the other kids are like, I'm Captain America, or whatever. And he's like, I'm Hitler.
I think that all the other kids are like, I'm not the Axis.
Yes.
I don't want to be Italian or German. I want to be British, American, or French. Or I want to be a member of La Résistance. And he's just like, nah.
It's more fun.
Yeah.
More fun playing the baddie.
And in time, even the younger kids got sick of Jim, but he didn't mind too much. He kept causing and performing his pet cemetery ritual all by himself. His outcast days came to a close when he hit prepubescence and found the Pentecostal church. The rolling around on the floor and speaking in tongues was right up his street, and the church loved Jim Jones and his rousing sermons. The Pentecostal congregation of Lynn, Indiana, hung on Jones's every word before he was even a teenager. He never got bored with the adoration and control that a preacher can wield, and by the time he was 25, Jim Jones took his show on the road and started his own church because nobody could do it better than him. Jones couldn't quite pay all of his bills with the word of the Lord just yet, so whilst building his following, he had a string of different jobs, some of them more weird than others. And it is actually quite common for killers, cults, and queens to have weird careers before they turn to a life of crime. Bundy working on a suicide hotline is a personal favourite of mine. Obviously, John Wayne Gacy, clown. But Jim Jones definitely had the strangest job. He was a door-to-door chimpanzee salesman. And I read that when he was doing this, he put his adverts in the paper, right? And this lady called Edith had a chimpanzee that hung itself. So she got in touch with Jim Jones because she wanted to replace it. I'm like, if you had a chimpanzee that hung itself, you shouldn't get another one.
No, that's it. No more chimps for you.
No. Oh my God, I will tell you about this at length in Under the Duvet, but I went to see Brian Blessed on We Can Be Weirdos last night.
Oh, yeah.
And he does a lot of work with animals and apes specifically. And he was like, did you know that gorillas laugh? I was like, no, Brian, I didn't know that. He just used to go to animal reserves and fucking wrestle gorillas.
Of course he did.
Like, oh my God, I can't go on because I will just start crying. So we'll leave that, but there will be more monkeys next week.
So moving on from the monkeys. Armed with his own congregation and never one to fade into the crowd, adult Jim Jones prioritized establishing his very own brand of Christianity. Pentecostal prayer just wasn't doing it for him anymore, so he spiced his services up with radical socialism. And again, this is like classic burgeoning cult leader behavior. It's like take a religion or a set of beliefs that people already buy into, get them through the door, and then overlay it with your own predilections. And this idea of radical socialism in the south of the US in the 50s may seem like it was a risky move, but it was actually an incredibly effective tactic. All of the big cults that you've ever heard of, Children of God, the Branch Davidians, Om Shinrikyo, etc., all managed to align their cult ascendancy with epochs of significant cultural flux. Jim Jones and what would become the People's Temple were no different. The US was disillusioned with capitalism, post-war consumerism masquerading as patriotism, and in 1955, it all kicked off in Vietnam. People were sick of it. There was a whole generation of Americans looking for a different way of life. Some turned to LSD, some founded the American Atheist Society, others followed the Grateful Dead from coast to coast, and unfortunately, some soul searchers found Jim Jones and the People's Temple.
The American dream was dead, and millions were looking for something to fill the void it had left behind. And Jim Jones bellowed from the rooftops that he had the answer. Material wealth was pointless, the pursuit of riches was vapid, and the real truth was, no one should be poor, ever, at all, for any reason. The land of the free had just survived McCarthy and his blacklists. Watch Trumbo, it's amazing. So, communism was not considered to be a particularly good look. But Jim Jones had great news for anyone worried about being labelled a grubby commie. The big JC himself was a communist. And no matter what American politicians these days want you to think, being a communist is a very Christian thing to be. Aside from the opiate of the people stuff, the Reverend Jim Jones kept that Jim to himself. Helen Hot Takes is back after a year's break, I think, and I will die on this hill at Calgary. Jesus was a communist, and I have biblical backup. When I've spoken to people about this before, they're like, no, socialism. I'm like, well, no, because the major difference between communism and socialism is private property. In socialism, you can have it, and in communism, you can't. And Jesus did not fuck with private property, and if you don't believe me, I'm going to tell you. So we've spoken before about the eye of a needle, and it being a parable where Jesus says there's as much chance as a rich man getting into heaven as a camel going through the eye of a needle, and that's been reinterpreted now to be like, well, there's a gate in Jerusalem, and you could just about fit a camel through it. And I think we spoke about it in Virginia Hall, and I don't think I was clear. It's not that being rich is the thing that gets you into heaven. It's if you are rich, you can't get in because you should have given it away. And that's not all I've got. I've got Luke 12:33. Jesus commanded his disciples to sell everything they had and give the money they made to the poor. Luke 14:33. Jesus told his followers that no one could be his disciple who had not forsaken all of their possessions. And then we've got Acts 22:44-45, which goes like this. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute all the proceeds to all, as any had need. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. And that sounds like a commune to me. And then, of course, there are the classics. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. That's Matthew 6:24. And who can forget Timothy 6:10? For the love of money is the root of all evil, which, while some coveted after, they have erred from their faith and pierced themselves through with many arrows. Not everyone agrees with my take. The Catholic Church famously are quite attached to money and the pursuit of it. But by far, the most hilarious criticism I saw online when I was looking into this, the theory that, Jesus is a big fat commie and all of the quotes I just had for you, I saw someone saying, well, he couldn't have been a communist because Jesus wasn't political. He started a revolution. How is that not political? That is bonkers to me. Anyway, here endeth the lesson. The mass has ended. Go forth in peace. It is all in there, in the good book. And Jim Jones milked it for all it was worth to fuel his followers' fire for radical socialism.
A fire that was ignited within Jim Jones during his years of childhood poverty in an in-between war hellhole. Feeling excluded and an outcast as a child manifested in a fervent support of racial integration. Jones felt so strongly about the civil rights movement that he went no contact with his own father over it.
The story is that Jim Jones brings a black person that he's met to his childhood home for dinner, and his father refuses to let them in. And he never spoke to his father again after that.
And Jones walked the walk too. He adopted multiple children from various racial backgrounds into his rainbow family. And actually, Jim Jones was the first white man to adopt a black child in the history of the state of Indiana. Similarly to his communism enthusiasm, Jim Jones's passion for racial equality was a breath of long-awaited fresh air in a country that was entirely fed up. And he had more tricks up his showman's sleeves to convert people to his cause as well. He had no problem razzle-dazzling the crowds that he drew to his church, but he really bowled them over when he cracked out those miracle healings.
I can never talk about the laying of hands and, the miracle healings within the church without thinking about that Simpsons episode where Bart becomes an evangelical preacher. And I think he's talking to a preacher and he's, I just always figured I'd do the deathbed confession. And the preacher just goes, but in this case, you're covered for sudden death. And introducing the healings really worked. Jones's parish wasn't pulling in rookie numbers anymore. The Reverend was now firmly in the big leagues. Of course, he wasn't actually magic, and God didn't actually bestow Jones with the power of laying on hands because God doesn't exist, and Jones was just your run-of-the-mill con man. It was all a part of Jones's three-ring circus. Dramatic and sparkly bollocks, but bollocks. All the same. The lame who could walk and the blind who could see after a session with Jones were all stooges that he'd planted in the crowd himself. So sure, at this stage in the game, Jim Jones was deceiving his followers 100%. But loads of faiths do that. Jones expected tithes from his patrons, but again, loads of organised religions ask for 20% of their congregants' income. So far, so normal, legitimate religion. There's air quotes around legitimate, but that's my own problem. And trauma. Moving on. Some members of the early People's Temple sold their homes and handed over everything they had to Jones's mission. And he did do good with those funds. He built old people's homes and fed the needy and started a rehab program, which in hindsight is woefully ironic, considering that Jones would go on to develop a sizable stimulant problem of his very own. At this point in the story we have for you this week, Jim Jones hasn't done anything that doesn't happen in legitimate religions yet.
Irony aside, it seems like as good a time as any to attempt to answer the question in everyone's ears. What is the difference between a legitimate faith and a cult? Well, if you believe musical legend Frank Zappa, the only difference between the two is how much real estate they own. But there is a little bit more to it than that. Let's start with what's the same. Both religions and cults expect followers to accept the supernatural, venerate sacred symbols, accept outlandish ideology, revere their leaders, follow a special doctrine that makes them better than everyone else. And then there's the chanting and the rituals, and if you're a Catholic, the the cannibalism.
Cash cannibalism.
The difference between a religion and a cult really lies within the leader. A cult always has a human who assumes the living deity top spot sooner or later. This divine ruler can never be wrong, and questioning the man-god is totally unthinkable for any of their adherents. People who end up in cults have to submit to their leader, and everything they have, mentally, physically, spiritually, economically, and almost always sexually.
It always gets there in the end, doesn't it?
It really does. I think, again, it comes down to that. Like, what is the end goal of the cult leader? They're not just doing it for... Like, when we did Sinister Societies, yes, we definitely saw cults that start off as just like their business operations. It's free work, essentially, enslaving people to work in their fucking tea packaging factories or whatever. But more often than not, it does go beyond the economical into some sort of weird sexual perversions. The other thing with a cult really is that there is no information that can be deemed as true or even consumable or listenable, readable, beyond what the cult leader is saying. So it is a complete one-way spouting of information from the cult leader, and all other sources from the outside world are gone. You're also obviously completely cut off from your family, like in an abusive relationship. You want to cut that person off from family, friends. They have nowhere else to go. They've given you all of their money. They've given you everything. They're completely bought into this. There is nothing else now. You own them. A cult leader's relationship with their devotees is essentially some perverse combination of terrorist meets domestic abuser meets serial killer of the mind and soul.
Yeah. Put that on a fridge magnet. And on top of all of that, Jim Jones wasn't paying for rehab and end-of-life care because he wanted to help anyone. Being totally devoid of empathy, Jones was doing all of those things to gain the adoration of those around him. That was all he ever wanted, and everything he ever did was to try and reach the ultimate target: complete control over as many people as possible. Top-level manipulation of anyone is difficult. Puppeteering whole groups of people is even harder. And the only way Jim Jones could get his followers to the point of adoration-fueled total compliance was to break them. And even for him, it would take years. The first step to identity decimation for the People's Temple came when Jones's most devout followers moved into People's Temple HQ. They didn't really have anywhere else to go after they sold their houses to fund their illustrious leaders' vanity projects. And those people would work 20 hours a day. They had no choice. All of their money was tied up in the church and released to them as an allowance whenever Jones felt like it. On occasion, these workers would be forced to stay awake for 6 days straight, which would certainly turn me subservient. If anyone even thought about complaining, Jones barked at his most loyal legion that if they truly wanted to change the world, they needed to serve their omnipotent master, and God to a lesser extent, and radical socialism on the daily.
As his live-in followers' capacity to resist dwindled, Jones's megalomania did the exact opposite. During this period, Jim Jones would also give one of his most famous sermons. After whipping himself up into a furious frenzy, he flung a Bible across the room. And when he was not smote by Almighty God for desecrating his holy text, Jones screamed at his very tired temple dwellers, "There is no heaven up there. We have to make heaven down here." That Bible flinging was a turning point for the People's Temple. The paving of the road to Jonestown had begun. Claiming that there's never been a heaven to a Christian congregation seems a bit rogue. But according to Jones, that had been his plan all along. The doctrine of Jesus was just a tool to reel in his own apostles. And now he had them, he was going to sink them.
I'm not sure how much I believe it when he says, "I never believed in the Christian God." I think he comes to that conclusion later on when he's like, oh, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
I can do more. I can take more. I can be more powerful. I can have control over more people. God's in the way.
Yeah. It's the natural evolution of someone with the personality makeup of somebody like Jim Jones. You are entrancing all of these people, hundreds, then thousands of people. Why just be God's footman? Make yourself the God. And that's exactly what he does. So communist Jesus got bumped. Jim Jones was the king of heaven now. And the new king's following got so big that Jones decided that he had outgrown Indiana.
No king, silence you fools! I will be king. And you'll never go hungry again! He's Scar, just like Beyonce. In 1965, with his desperately devoted acolytes in tow, Jim Jones moved the whole operation to somewhere called Ukiah, California, which is kind of bumfuck nowhere. I did look it up and try and find out fun facts. There aren't. Why there, you might be asking? Well, it's another well-timed ideological stroke from Jim Jones. The US was enduring the height, the apex, the peak of the Cold War, and global nuclear fallout was a very real threat that every level of society was genuinely worried about. And Jones, being Scar, used that atmosphere of terror to his advantage. He told the temple that Ukiah was the only bit of the United States that would survive a nuclear holocaust. Jones wasn't actually bothered about the end of civilization via explosion. He just wanted to isolate the People's Temple from the outside world, and handily for him, this narrative also revealed Jones to be the keeper of most secret atomic truths, and also hinted towards the end being extremely fucking nigh. Loads of birds, one Ukiah-shaped stone.
And so, 80 members of the People's Temple left the crossroads of America behind and followed Reverend Jim Jones to California. And one of these people was Edith, the monkey lady.
Yeah, she goes with him.
She's like, you know what? Let's see what happens here. It is weird, though. It is weird.
I mean, if you have a chimpanzee as a pet, you're already weird. And if it hangs itself, you're double weird.
This is true. This is true. And sadly for Edith, after she left California, weird or not, she was never seen again.
The crossroads of America is the Indiana state motto, which I just think is tragic. Nothing, just passing through.
By 1971, Jones's follower count had catapulted into the thousands. Devotees of the People's Temple lived together, ate together, and they worked together. More cult klaxons going off immediately, and differences from religion. Once again, you're not just like, oh, go home. You're still part of the cult, right? See you next week when you're here for all the enslavement and the sexual abuse. No, we live together on this compound. You never leave. We feed you gruel, no protein so that your brain dies.
Yes, and I believe it's Mike Rinder, who used to be like top henchman at Scientology and then left. The point he makes about David Miscavige and Scientology is he's like, the reason why it is a cult, I mean many, but the most easy one to explain is that if you leave Christianity or Buddhism, no one's coming after you.
Exactly. So yeah, it's all much easier to control people if they're all locked down in one place, devoid of any sort of outside influence. And it also turns people against each other pretty fucking quickly.
It's amazing how quickly it happens. And obviously they're tired and they're hungry. But like, I've lived in many a share house in my life. And sometimes, I mean, obviously everything is going to be, we're all just the sum of our experiences, right? And if you're having a bad week and someone uses your mug, you want to fucking smash them into the wall.
Yeah.
We've all been there.
It's sadly true. So for that reason, all of the reasons we just said, lifelong sleepovers are another essential part of the cult leader manifesto. And Jones wanted as many pajama pals as possible. To that end, Jones collected the most attractive of his live-in congregation and sent them off on Greyhound buses to lure in more of their kind, all the while banging on about socialism. Everyone of any colour or creed was welcome within the People's Temple, but Jim Jones wanted successful hotties to join the ranks the most. The 10 out of 10s are always the ones the charismatic preacher wants.
We talked about this a lot on Sinister Societies. Like, yeah, and as we said at the beginning, nobody knowingly joins a cult. But cult leaders want attractive, successful, intelligent people because they get more people to join.
Absolutely. And I think there's also a misconception that people who join cults are at the bottom of the barrel in their lives, and that's why they join a cult. Like we said, people don't join cults thinking they're cults. And that is not true. Typically, people who join cults are people who are successful, who are intelligent. And typically the reason they join is because they're looking for a reason, a purpose to life that is bigger than them. And that, my friends, is the most inviting thing for a cult leader, because he or she can promise it to you. And they also want people that are going to come there and fucking work, not a bunch of people that are like, who haven't achieved anything in their lives anyway. They're not going to achieve anything in your fucking cult. And they're also not going to lure more people like them into the cult, like you said.
I know this is going to sound like I'm not going anywhere, but it will make sense. Did you know that cromulent has been added to the dictionary this year? And it's a Simpsons reference. And I think it's Mrs. Krabappel. She's like, I never heard the word cromulent before I moved to Springfield. And everyone's like, cromulent is a completely normal word. I think it's particularly cromulent. Like, and now it's been put in the dictionary as I use it just to see people's reaction, and they never fucking get it. Anyway, this will make sense because of the next word I'm going to say. Embiggened by his surge in sign-ups, Jones started to publicly proclaim that he was doing what God had never done. He was building heaven on earth. And that rhetoric might have put some people off, but not many, honestly. Politicians especially loved a bit of Jimmy J.
This was the biggest shock to me when we were writing the book, and just discovering how many politicians had Jim Jones's back, who were so bought into this idea. And again, look, don't think about the deaths that happen. This is at a point where he seems to be preaching something that is totally revolutionary and potentially nation-changing. We know what happens, though.
Every government bod in the Bay Area and beyond knew that if they just dropped the Reverend a line, Jones would guarantee that a huge crowd of temple followers would show up to their next fundraiser /rally /rodeo /lemonade stand. And this rent-a-crowd situation from the People's Temple was instrumental in 1970s local government elections in San Francisco, and was also a keystone of the Jonestown cult grab of political influence. This breaks my heart. Jim Jones was so successful. Angela Davis and Harvey Milk, I'm less bothered about Harvey Milk, are both on record saying that Jim Jones and the People's Temple were something to be admired.
Oh, yeah.
I love Angela Davis. And when I learned that, my world was a little bit worse.
I'm sure hers was too once she found out what Jimmy got up to in the end.
She comes back next week, and she's in contact with him right until the very end.
So we've got the big following, tick. The era of politicians, tick. Communal living, the total dedication to the living divine leader, tick, tick, tick. The financial abuse, the divide, the conquer, the recruitment department. All big ticks, but what comes next? Weird sex stuff, of course.
Always in the end.
Jim Jones told his followers that he was the only truly heterosexual man on planet Earth. According to Jimmy, every other man on the planet was secretly gay.
And I really thought about this, and I was like, what is he getting from that rhetoric? But it's instilling this sense of shame, isn't it? And, you don't know yourself, I know you.
And I think it also is that, I don't know why he says he's the only heterosexual, but the reason he's definitely telling his followers that all the other men are gay is because he wants to sexually abuse all the other men.
Yes, and he does.
Yes. He's like, you're gay, I'm straight,
yeah,
but you're gay,
yes,
and I know you want me to touch you because I'm the man god, so let me touch you, let me sexually abuse you, because you're a gay man, so don't worry about it. And that's exactly what he did. And he did this all, abusing his male followers, all whilst claiming adamantly that he was utterly reviled by man-on-man action, but that he did it anyway to feel closer to God.
He did sexually abuse the women too, more, but yeah, he goes after the men too.
And that's also not where the sex statutes in the People's Temple ended. Jones also banned all sex outside of marriage for members of the temple. And they weren't allowed to have babies either. In the Ukiah Collective, adoption was the only option.
Now, even if you're married, you're not allowed to have babies.
That's weird. That is unusual for a cult leader because typically they want everyone to be having lots of babies in the cult so that you're succession planning the next generation of the cult.
I think yes, totally agree. I think he does it because his adoption of multiple children from different racial backgrounds was a really key thing in him setting himself apart. And, it's him walking the walk, right? So I think that's why it's I adopt and therefore you adopt.
And possibly also, if you're doing adoptions, right, you can adopt older children and you can adopt more children than a woman is capable of giving birth to in a year or in a set amount of time. You can grow the group faster through adoption, perhaps, than through natural births. And also, you can bring in kids that are older who are going to become, part of the working age of the cult sooner than a newborn baby. And possibly also, when people have kids, they're distracted. They're more likely to perhaps think about that child and that baby and the environment that they're putting them in, and maybe they leave the church, which we've seen. And, other cults get around that by removing the children, breaking those bonds, familial bonds, separating the child, and talking about, it takes a village, communal rearing. There's no connection between the parent and the child. Maybe Jim Jones just couldn't be bothered with all that.
I think he considered that and he came up with a plan, which is what you're going to say next.
Because those in the People's Temple who had already procreated had to bring their children with them to the People's Paradise. And once initiated, parents were forced to sign statements declaring that they had molested their own children.
That's how he does it.
The administrators of the temple would then confiscate these confessions as collateral. And there aren't many religions out there that I know of that do that. So yes, evil and smart.
But if you are looking at how to be a successful cult leader, Jim Jones is kind of the best to ever do it.
Oh, 100%. Look, success and goodness, morality don't necessarily go hand in hand. I also read that, the most successful people, this is not going to be a particular shock to a lot of people who succeed in business, do absolutely have narcissistic traits. And the one thing that differentiates people who have narcissistic traits who are successful in life and business versus who are not is conscientiousness. If you have narcissistic personality traits, but you're also conscientious, that's like the holy pairing of success. And Jim Jones certainly has those things.
And sexy sanctions weren't the only thing that were getting wild in the People's Temple. Jones had also started to speak very openly about his obsession with suicide and his deep-seated concern that he would be assassinated. Jones was convinced that he was just as politically significant as Malcolm X or Dr. Martin Luther King, making him just as much of a target of the establishment.
And here we see more evidence of his grandiosity. I'm not saying that Jim Jones wasn't very culturally significant. He fucking has 1,000 people kill themselves. But he is already, placing himself on that level. And that persecutory feeling, that paranoia, again, it's because he's saying, I'm so important. I'm changing things so much that the establishment is after me. It's wild.
And all he needed was for everyone else to think that too. So Jim Jones did what he did best. The Reverend decided to put on a show.
Yeah, because there's nothing that's going to strengthen the bonds within a group more than an external enemy.
The curtain went up during a church picnic in 1972. The People's Temple had moved their HQ to San Francisco by then, probably because Harvey Milk was such a JJ fanboy. And as everyone was tucking into their socialist sandwiches, Jim Jones was, seemingly out of nowhere, shot in the chest. This assassination attempt sent shockwaves through the People's Temple. They now had proof that their leader was right. The capitalists were trying to kill him because he knew too much. They didn't, they weren't, it wasn't. And Jones wasn't shot at all. He'd set the whole thing up himself. Just like the miracle healings that put him on the map in Indiana years before.
But the People's Temple were convinced that their king of socialism, who had all their money and contracts of child abuse, was in very real danger. So they closed ranks, and more importantly, became even more frightened of the world outside the Jonesosphere, further consolidating Jim's dictator domination. Now he had sorted out the outside influence problem. The double down continued. Next up, Jones needed to make sure no pesky whispers of dissent appeared on the inside either. So he ordained the Planning Commission within the People's Temple, who we have affectionately rechristened the Narc Squad.
Hate them.
Any suspected defectors that the Narc Squad caught wind of would be called out in front of the entire congregation, and Jim Jones himself. Predictably, these public shamings quickly turned into public beatings. And we know that because all these sessions were recorded on audio tape. Handily for us, narcissists love keeping records of their achievements, and it's a major reason why we know more about the inner workings of the People's Temple than we do about some other cults.
It's also why we know more about Goebbels than we know about other high-ranking Nazis, because before he killed himself, he shrank all of his diaries to microfiche and buried them. He wanted it to be found, and that's why we talk about Goebbels so much more than we do about others, because we know.
Of course. They want to keep a record. They believe that they're right. They believe that they're completely valid in what they're doing. And, these kind of public meetings where people are berated amongst the other group, it's of course there to spread fear, keep people in control. And it is very, very much the same as the struggle sessions of Maoist China. He is using so many influences to build this cult, and it's working.
And these recordings are out there. In one of the Planning Commission court recordings, an alleged dissenter has their newly pierced ears ripped apart, and Jim Jones can be very clearly heard in the background laughing like a maniac. The suicide infatuation subplot continued throughout these years as well. And one night, Jones gathered his closest confidants and hosted a little wine evening. After they'd all finished their glasses, Jones told them that they had all just drunk poison. He wanted to see how they would react to dying for the cause. An act that he called revolutionary suicide. That time, he was lying about the poison chalices, but we all know where this is going.
When 1974 rolled around, Jones decided that constructing the Garden of Eden in the United States was never going to happen.
Because of the capitalist pig dogs, it's all their fault. They're not going to let you win.
So he came up with a new plan and spent some of the money he had stolen from all of his followers to buy a plot of land in Guyana, in the middle of the jungle. 19 hours by boat away from anything, and a bit of land that was only aeronautically accessible by a teeny tiny airstrip. This patch of dense wilderness would be where the People's Temple would build the utopia that Jim Jones had been banging on about since he was a kid. Over the course of a year, Jones secretly started to dispatch his favourite narcs to the jungle. They would fly in small groups from different airports so as not to attract any attention. Jones wanted to keep his master plan very firmly under wraps. The first teams of temple members that were sent down to Central America were ecstatic with excitement. They truly believed they were on their way to a better world. And it was one that they got to help build.
Jim Jones's son, the one he adopts, Jim Jones Jr., big surprise, he goes on Oprah and he says exactly the same thing. He was like, no, we really believed it. And try as he might, Jones Sr. didn't get away with that covert migration program for very long. Because the press were finally onto him. A group of 10 temple defectors who had managed to escape Jim Jones in his earlier, less intense iterations told New West magazine their stories of sexual abuse, violence, imprisonment, kidnapping, humiliation, child abuse, and fraud. And crucially, these dissenters knew that proof existed to substantiate all of their claims because they knew about the tapes that would blow the whole Jonestown operation wide open. This league of ex-Templars were led by journalist Grace Stowen, whose estranged husband, Tim, had been a prominent member of the People's Temple and Jones's chief legal advisor. She also takes the temple to court because they will not release her son. And he's living in Jonestown, and they won't give him back. And that court case drew even more attention to what was happening. But somehow, probably Harvey Milk again, Jones got hold of the exposé before it was printed, and he demanded that the publisher of New West kill the story. That publisher, thankfully, was immune to the paranoid lunatic demanding press censorship, and that left Jim Jones with just one option. When he realised that the New West article exposing him was not going to be pulled, Jim Jones turned to his advisors at the People's Temple and simply told them, "We're leaving tonight." The Reverend Jim Jones landed in Guyana 6 hours before the story that would bring it all crashing down hit the stands.
He must have known, deep down, that he couldn't hide in the jungle forever. But nevertheless, Jim Jones ordered a mass exodus of the temple members who hadn't already been sent down to Guyana on bushwhacking duty. Once Jones made it to his new open-air compound, ironically much more difficult to escape from than a regular prison, Jones dismissed any pressure coming from America as just pure jealousy. That pressure was coming from families that temple members had left behind. A whole load of them had started to ring the alarm and to state the painfully obvious. With the People's Temple now in the middle of the actual jungle, Jones's congregants were more isolated than they had ever been before. Not only from those who loved them, but from any source of information that wasn't Jim Jones. He had become the tree of knowledge at last. Again, absolutely, like we said, classic requirement for a cult leader to survive. And in their jungle prison, Jones's followers kept at it, and the construction of heaven on earth continued with strengthened fervour, and was given the desperately unimaginative title, the People's Temple Agricultural Project.
He's a lot of things, but not creative isn't one of them. Could you not have tried a bit harder?
It just sounds so like, I think
the Future Planning Committee.
Yeah, the Future Planning Committee. I guess like there's that element of it to the outside, right? It's the People's Temple Agricultural Project, but also it sounds very communist.
That's true.
Strip back, no frills. It is what it is, but it's obviously not what it is. It's anything but what it is. So Jones's followers did get the rainbows, smiles, and dancing that they were promised, but they also got a sinister speaker system that would blast their leaders' apocalyptic warnings on a constant loop. They couldn't even escape him in their dreams because the tapes played through the night so that the People's Temple could learn in their sleep.
This many years into his tyrannical reign, Jim Jones had developed a life-threatening addiction to prescription drugs. Once quite lean, as I said, he was now as swollen as an amphetamine-addled blimp. His speech was slurred and his signature dark glasses look was born. A flailing attempt to hide how off his tits he was all the time. Similarly to other famous speed fiends in the political field, Jones argued that he had to be awake all the time so he could work for the socialist supremacy 24 hours a day. It's not a new idea. Thatcher famously only needed 4 hours of sleep a night and she never did anything bad. And if any residents of the agricultural projects had any problems understanding their once eloquent overlord, they were sent to the Red Brigade, who were essentially the narc squad, now with added guns, who would clarify things for them. And that's still not the worst of it. After the mass migration south post-press close call, the People's Temple agricultural project had much bigger problems than Jim Jones's slurred serenades. The infrastructure the first missionaries had constructed was only built to support 400 people. By 1977, there were 1,000 souls living on that patch of cleared Guyanese jungle, and the camp was crumbling under the population pressure.
The agricultural bit had also not gone so well. Food was running out fast, and the food they did manage to cultivate in the unforgiving equatorial heat wasn't being stored properly, so it went mouldy. Perhaps this farming fail is what prompted the name change, because the agricultural project was no more. They all lived in Jonestown now. The People's Temple had always been hungry, but never like this. In the ruins of their socialist utopia, dedicants of Jones were fed a tiny bowl of rice with milk, water, and a bit of brown sugar at 6 a.m. After that, they had to spend at least 10 grueling hours working in the fields under the beating tropical sun, desperately attempting to grow more rice, but knowing that it would just be destroyed by the damp as soon as it was harvested.
It's like pushing the boulder up the hill forever, isn't it?
And the day didn't end there either. Once home from the paddies, the speakers would boom out the news according to the brain of a madman on meth. Then there was dinner, which, surprise, surprise, was more rice, this time with gravy, and whatever greens grow in Guyana. And then, after dinner, it was time for Russian lessons, because Russia was a place that Jim Jones had always called paradise on earth.
Yes, he has this obsession with Russia for obvious reasons. And there is a period of time where things start to go tits up in Guyana, where he tells the People's Temple that they're all going to go there. I don't think he ever really meant that. But he does give them this hope that they could get out.
Yeah, because that's, again, a very, very key part of cults. When people are starving, when they are at each other's throats, when they're being knocked on left, right, and centre, going through these fucking struggle sessions, listening to you blasting out your madness on tape night and day, the only thing that keeps them going is hope. And that's why doomsday cults are very interesting, because they constantly, if the world doesn't end, like they say, just have to keep pushing that date further and further back. And I know that sounds weird because it's like hope, but for them it is, because it's like the start of a new world, whatever. And for Jim Jones, it's like hope was in short supply by this point.
And anyone who complained about this miserable existence would be reported straight to Jones himself, who would accuse them of being in league with the CIA, who were deliberately destroying his crop to sabotage his socialist serenity. And given the growing viciousness of the public shamings, this made for some very compliant congregants indeed. Children ratted on their parents. Parents betrayed their own children. Hungry people are desperate people. By October 1977, there were 1,000 starving zombies clinging to life in Jonestown. Too hungry, too scared, and too trapped to disobey or dissent. And to be honest, we think Jim Jones got bored of it. There aren't enough drugs in the world to keep a schedule that repetitive interesting forever.
This time, he turned to an old favourite of his to liven up life in the jungle. The public shamings were back, but this time reinvented as People's Forum. People's Forum became a 3-night-a-week fixture, and it was branded as an opportunity for the congregants to show their leader just how loyal they were to him, by squealing on their comrades. Jones would preside over these events, sat, naturally, on a throne, and they would run long into the night. Often the community would only be afforded 3 hours sleep before the waking night terror began all over again. So just like they had in California years before, People's Forum devolved into some sort of gladiatorial arena before anyone could realize what had happened. Jones would demand his community to divulge their darkest secrets and sins to him. And whatever they said would be noted by the Red Brigade and stored on their collective brain cloud if anyone needed to be blackmailed later on. And just like everything else in Jonestown, People's Forum, every excruciating moment of it was all recorded on cassette.
Despite all of the danger, hunger, violence, and threats, some of those imprisoned in Jonestown did attempt escape. Some of them made it, but most of them were quickly caught by the Super Narc Squad, and they would be taken straight to a shit pit entitled the Extra Care Unit. Whilst interred, the attempted escapees would be drugged for weeks on end, and when they were finally released back into the general population, they were so traumatised that they struggled to even speak. Jim Jones's drug intake had graduated from average stimulants to Valium and synthetic morphine, and he was starting to crack. He spent most of his time locked away in his hut, reading Marx and suffering a series of strokes. No one called him the Reverend anymore. Now, the residents of Jonestown called the man who dragged them all down there Dad.
Ugh, I hate that.
And Dad was more paranoid than he had ever been before. And he was kind of onto something.
I hate it. It just makes me think of David Cameron being like, call me Dave.
He had a reason to be paranoid. The worried families of the Jonestown dwellers and Greystone's gang had joined forces back in California. Any letters that families received from the missing were clearly censored and manipulated if they ever arrived at all. So the pressure was mounting back on American soil for someone, somewhere, with some semblance of power to do something.
And finally, after years of lobbying, someone did. In late 1977, the Federal Communications Commission launched an investigation into the jungle dystopia. And Angela Davies managed to get this information about the investigation to Jones.
Angela, we need to chat. I have such a soft spot for her. I think she's so incredible. And it's her. She's the one.
She is.
She sets this all in motion. And I can't imagine having to live with that.
And Jim Jones, following this message from Angela, lost any scrap of rationality that he may still have had rattling around in that skull of his. Radical action was his only way out, and he needed to prepare his troops. And this is where we enter the next comparison of a cult leader to another type of killer that we've come across, the family annihilator.
Yeah.
Jim Jones drilled his people relentlessly. The most famous of these siege practices went on for 6 days and nights.
You can look it up. They just call it the 6-night siege.
Ugh. The 1,000 starving and brutalized members of the People's Temple were forced to do a week of apocalyptic roleplay in preparation for some sort of invasion.
He tells them that the CIA have them surrounded. And they're sitting in their little huts with machetes, waiting for it to happen, and it never happens.
And the siege only ended when a group attempted to escape the chaos by boat to Cuba.
And it was during this live-action horror show that the People's Temple started its routine of infamous White Nights. And White Nights is the term that is used for times when members of the People's Temple would practice committing mass suicide.
Fun!
But it just shows you how fucking done for they were.
Absolutely. I mean, they've witnessed night after night for weeks and weeks, sat there starving and tired and hungry, the brutality that Jim Jones is raining down on them. And he's telling them, there's somebody way worse than me coming for you. And why wouldn't they believe it?
During these White Nights, the People's Temple were all instructed to line up, and they were given a glass of red stuff to drink, including the children. And they were told that it was poison and that in just 45 short minutes they would all be dead. And all the while the man they called Dad would repeat to them that if they couldn't live the way they wanted, then they wouldn't live at all. And then he tells them that it's all not true. Multiple times. This happens at least twice. Anyone who couldn't fulfill Jim Jones's revolutionary suicide was labelled a coward and a traitor. And Jones would reveal to his followers that these were just dry runs. But very soon, it would not be. And he tells them that. He tells them, one day this will be for real. And it will be soon.
This went on for months, and it concluded on the 17th of November, 1978, when 53-year-old Californian Congressman Leo Ryan took a delegation down to Guyana to try and figure out what the hell was going on down there. When he landed on the remote airstrip and strolled into Jonestown, these government employees were met with a celebratory reception.
It's like thunderous.
Yeah. Jonestown and everyone in it appeared to be very happy to host the congressman and his delegation. It appeared to Ryan's team that the People's Temple were really excited to show them everything they had achieved in the jungle, away from capitalist interference. But in a matter of hours, it would all go very, very wrong. And that, comrades, is where we shall pick up next week.
Yeah. See you in the jungle.
No.
Be good, don't listen to the tapes, I beg you. And we'll see you next week for, you know what happened.
For part 2, and also the end of 2024.
Oh my God, I didn't even think.
Here at Red Handed. Next week's Jonestown Part 2 will be the final episode for this year. Hannah and I will be taking a much-needed little break over December, and we will be back in January with a fucking hell of a case. We'll be back specifically, if you are a Wondery Plus subscriber, we'll be back on the 2nd of January with our first of 2 parts on the death of Ellen Greenberg. I tried very hard not to say murder. We'll get to it.
Yes. In the meantime, be good.
Be good. Be as good as you can and don't be a cult leader. And we'll see you then. Bye, guys.
I'm Hannah.
I'm Sruti.
And welcome back to part 2 of our Jonestown series. And I can't say welcome to the jungle because I said that in part 1.
Enter the Dragon?
Enter the Dragon, yeah. Last week we gave you, I should say, if you want to read more about Jonestown, if you want to know about Jim Jones, the best book is The Road to Jonestown. If you want to know about the people, it's called 1,000 Lives. Those are your 2 options. Last week we gave you The Road to Jonestown. And this week, we're going to lay out how it all went so horribly wrong. Last week, we left you on the precipice of disaster, the likes of which the world hadn't seen since the human sacrifices of the ancients. Californian Congressman Leo Ryan had been tasked with finding out what the bollocks was going on in the Guyanese jungle. The alarm had been raised by those that the People's Temple left behind. Any communication that loved ones had received from those who had left for the wilderness seemed redacted and strange. Some families never received any word at all from those who had followed the Reverend Jim Jones to build the socialist utopia that no one would escape. On top of that, allegations of human rights abuses by Jones upon his flock had been brought to the press by former members of the People's Temple who had got out before it was too late. And it was Leo Ryan's job to find out if any of that was true. He was used to conducting investigations. In 1965, he had headed the inquiry after the Watts Rebellion in Los Angeles. Ryan took this job so seriously that he went undercover and got himself arrested. Imagine a congressman doing that now.
Can't.
No. But unfortunately for Leo Ryan and his family, and anyone who knew him, his incognito courage would not be the legacy he left behind.
The congressman was actually a lot closer to the People's Temple than you may think. He had been close with a temple member called Bob Houston, whose mutilated remains were found by a railway line in 1976. 3 days after he and his ex-wife had a conversation about leaving Jim Jones's congregation. That escape exchange, like all of the other evidence that we have, was recorded on cassette. No one knows exactly what happened to Bob, but the People's Temple connection is hard to ignore. And when Leo Ryan read an article in the San Francisco Examiner, examining the suspicions held about the goings-on in Guyana, he announced that he was going to get down there and see for himself. And so, on the 17th of November 1978, Leo Ryan did just that. We told you about the joyous reception that Ryan and his team received when they landed in Jonestown. After they stopped rapturously clapping, the residents of the jungle immediately took the congressman on a tour of their open-air penitentiary.
Leo Ryan was impressed by what had been created. It was quite Spartan, but surely, under the tropical circumstances, that was to be expected. The People's Temple all lined up to tell the congressman and the journalists that he brought along how ecstatically happy they were with the life afforded to them in Jonestown by their dear leader, Jim Jones. That evening, everyone gathered in the pavilion where the People's Forum was now happening 3 times a week, and they ate, drank, and made merry. But the mask was starting to slip. Tension hung in the air. Faces were tight and laughter was forced. Then Leo Ryan cut through the tension, not with a knife, but with an endorsement. To all there gathered, Congressman Leo Ryan said, "Whatever the comments back home are, there are some people here who believe that this is the best thing to have ever happened in their whole lives." That statement was met with thunderous applause. Jonestown had pulled it off. They had convinced a delegation sent by Congress that absolutely nothing was wrong. And maybe, perhaps, kind of, Leo Ryan was convinced that everything was fine, or maybe this compliment was a tactic. I really don't know. I've really thought about it. But I can't escape that, he's an intelligent man, he's an experienced politician. I just find it really hard to believe that he spent a day in Jonestown and didn't feel like something was very, very wrong.
I mean, the people have been hungry there for a long time before he arrives. Are you not seeing the fact that they're all fucking looking a bit on the skinny side?
Aww.
And a bit on the dirty side? And a bit on the brainwashed, starry-eyed PTSD side? I don't know. Maybe it just makes for a better story about what we're about to tell you. Because despite all the whooping, there were some Jonestown residents that saw the congressional delegation for what it was, their chance to get out. One of those people was Vern Gosney. He knew that this was his only shot at freedom, and he was not willing to let it slip through his fingers. So Vern Gosney wrote a note, and it read, "Dear Congressman, Vern Gosney and Monica Bagby, please help us get out of Jonestown." Vern and Monica had both arrived in Guyana earlier that year and managed to subvert the infrastructure designed to turn them against each other, and instead became fast friends. Vern passed this desperate plea for help to Don Harris, an NBC reporter, not, as Vern had thought, a part of the congressional staff. This exchange was witnessed by one of the many children living in Jonestown, who immediately alerted the Red Brigade, and the Dad Loyalist hackles were well and truly raised.
Later on, after an assembly had concluded in the pavilion, Don Harris, the reporter, told Vern and Monica that they would have the first seats on the plane. And I can't imagine the relief that Vern must have felt. It was happening. He and Monica were actually going to get out after months of ego-shattering torture.
That fucking kid.
I know. Their road to Jonestown had ended. The next day, Vern and Monica were interviewed by Congressman Leo Ryan. And after that happened, Jim Jones approached the pair of them and asked them, "Are you lovers?" They absolutely were not lovers. In fact, the foundation of their relationship was that they were both gay. And Monica told Jim Jones that they weren't together, and then started to express some of her concerns about Jonestown to Jones himself. danger. Vern knew that this was extraordinarily bad news bears, and he stomped on Monica's foot to get her to shut up. He'd been in Jonestown longer than she had, and he knew that she was making a grave mistake. Jim Jones told Monica and Vern that they shouldn't speak to reporters because they were all liars, and for just one moment, Vern thought that Jim Jones might be right.
But then he changed his tack. Jim Jones told the two would-be defectors, "You can come back and visit your son anytime you want."
So Vern Gosney has a son
Mm-hmm.
who is in the jungle, and he leaves him behind. So that's what that's about.
But in just a few hours, there would be absolutely nothing to come back to. But for reasons we have pondered for years now, Congressman Ryan's team still did not understand the severity of the situation that they were in. So much so that Don Harris, 1978's nominee for the Worst Decision Award, handed the note that Vern had written the day before to Jim fucking Jones. On camera.
It's excruciating.
And NBC journalist Don Harris would pay the ultimate price for this mistake. Harris flat out asked Jim Jones why people were being held in Jonestown against their will. In the footage, Jones is visibly taken aback. He told Harris and the camera crew that Monica's worries were all total nonsense, and that anyone who wanted to leave was free to do so. And they always had been.
The news that Vern and Monica were getting out sped across the commune at the speed of light. And it wasn't long before the number of Jones devotees that wanted to leave the jungle on a tiny plane with Leo Ryan grew to more than 20. Jim Jones was incandescent, but even his drug-decimated brain knew that flying into a rage was not going to work in his favour. So he begged them to stay instead, like a dejected child. He says, "You can't leave me, you're my people." And it was during this imploring pandering that things started to go wrong. As Congressman Ryan watched this bizarre display, one of Jim Jones's most zealous henchmen pulled a knife and stabbed him, screaming, "All right, motherfucker, you are going to die." Any misunderstanding about how much danger the delegation were in vanished. It was now undeniably clear that they needed to get the fuck out faster than the words had crossed the camp that people were leaving.
It was now or never. Ryan's group and all those who had decided to leave made a break for it. An extra plane had been ordered for the additional escapees too. But neither the congressional team nor the journalists had arranged their own transfer to the airstrip, which meant that they were entirely reliant on Jim Jones's followers to get them there, which obviously did not go so well.
Oh.
Those brave enough to seize their chance clambered into the truck, and the driver reluctantly headed towards the airstrip. That truck, which kept stalling every 2 minutes, was followed by a tractor pulling a trailer carrying 8 of the most hard-line members of the Red Brigade. The Super Narc Squad were not going to let the delegation leave without a showdown. Even from a distance, it was clear that the cultists in the wagon were armed to the teeth.
As soon as the Red Brigade were in range of the defectors, they opened fire on the truck headed to the airstrip, the 2 charter planes, and the escapees' only hope. Under a flurry of gunfire, the runaways leapt out of the truck and ran for the planes on the tarmac. The truck driver slung a Yui and headed back to the compound. Leo Ryan, his team, the news crew, and the Jonestown deserters, against all the odds, made it onto those planes alive. The first plane wobbled down the tiny runway, and then the tractor caught up with it.
It's like it's not real.
I know. And the tractor blocked the flight path. So the pilot had no option. He had to stop, or the crash would kill them all.
I spent the weekend at home watching a lot of films because I couldn't go anywhere. Sick dog, no going outside. And I watched Escape Plan Have you seen it?
No, I've never heard of it.
I really enjoy like an old 90s era action movie. I think it was the golden age of the action movie. And it's got Sylvester Stallone in it. It's got 50 Cent in it. And it's great. It's basically about this guy, Ray Breslin, played by Sylvester Stallone, who gets put in prisons, like high maximum security prisons. And he has to try and escape to basically say whether that prison is
safe,
right. Inescapable, whether it's, you know, protecting the public by keeping the people in there actually on lockdown, or is there a way out? So that's his entire job. And it's obviously, as all 90s action films are, very over the top. There's lots of explosions. There's lots of like, That's what this feels like. I tried to watch Escape Plan 2. It was terrible. But this feels very much like Escape Plan 4, because there is an Escape Plan 3, which I don't plan on watching. Enter the Dragon in the Jungle. It's bonkers.
Yeah.
This just feels so Hollywood.
It really, really does. And I think because it is so unbelievable, it's really hard to tell the story, quite honestly, because the words don't exist. If there was any sense of relief inside those two little planes, it was short-lived. Because, in another twist, the escapees had a traitor in their ranks, determined to punish them for daring to leave Jonestown. I was thinking about this morning as I was cycling in. Vern Gosney and Monica, right? They know what's up. And this man who they know is hardline is sat in the trailer with them. So there must have been this feeling of like, I don't know, man. I don't like this.
And again, it's so movie-esque. Like this idea that, oh, you think you got away? Wait a minute. There's someone in here who's sabotaging everything.
Yeah.
So this guy's name was Larry Layton, and he occupied the seat next to Vern Gosney and behind Monica. As the plane's engine stuttered to a halt, Layton pulled out the gun that he had been concealing and shot Monica Bagby twice in the back. Then it was Vern's turn. Layton shot him 3 times. Now Vern managed to fight off the crazed gunman, and he and Monica and the pilot of the rickety plane made a break for it. The NBC crew, who were bound for the second plane, managed to capture the first few seconds of the chaos on camera. But for reasons that will become clear in a second, that was it. In the paranoid terror gunfight from Doom, the cameraman, Bob Brown, photographer Greg Robinson, reporter Don Harris, and Temple defector Patricia all died on the airstrip. And so did Congressman Leo Ryan, after he was shot 20 times.
The smaller plane did manage to take off and arrived in Guyana's capital, Georgetown, shortly afterwards, with Monica aboard, who later died of her injuries. Vern Gosney, the man who started the whole escape attempt, survived. And later he worked with San Diego State University to document what life and death in Jonestown was really like from someone who was there. He has a really lovely article called Remembering Monica, so I would recommend. It'll be in the show notes, actually, but it's a good read. 6 miles back into the jungle, blind and total panic gripped Jonestown. Jim Jones knew that his reign of terror was well and truly up.
It's so interesting, the thought process here. And look, Jim Jones has created this situation in which, like, it was inevitably going to boil over. But, like, if they had let Leo Ryan, the congressional delegation, go back to the US, the wheels of progress are slow. The wheels of justice are slow. Like, the chances that anything would have even happened and another big group from the US would have come back to investigate what was going on in Jonestown because of a note from one person who was there, 2 people who were there. I mean, it's not a guarantee that anything even would have happened. But when you shoot and kill Leo Ryan, congressman, they're coming for you.
Oh, yeah.
It's a very big miscalculation if we believe that Jim Jones had it within his control to stop this. The thing is, he's created these people who are zealous, who are not thinking clearly because that's exactly what he's done to them. and who react in a way that is going to ultimately lead to his downfall, which is murdering a congressional delegation.
Jones's top legal advisor, who's a guy called Charles Gary, tried to reassure his leader, but Jones wasn't having any of it. Jim Jones turned to Charles Gary and said, "I have failed. All is lost." An announcement rang out across the camp that told the People's Temple that everything was fine and absolutely nobody should panic. Congressman Ryan's betrayal was proof that the US government would never let them be happy and only wanted to drag them all back to the States and grind them down as cogs in the evil capitalist machine. So they should all just go back to their huts and await instruction. Meanwhile, Jones's closest companions filled a big metal tub with a chemical cocktail of all sorts, but most importantly, cyanide. And then they mixed it up with grape Flav-Or-Aid. The time had come.
The People's Temple all gathered in the pavilion, and the Reverend Jim Jones told them that there was only one way out. As with everything else in the Jonosphere, we know exactly what happened next, because it was all recorded. The death tape is still available for your listening pleasure today, but really consider whether that is something you really want living in your brain.
You can't unhear it.
I've never listened to it.
I have, and I wish I hadn't.
Now, although this final solution was a reaction to the catastrophic murder of a US congressman, nothing was left to chance. The People's Temple had been rehearsing their revolutionary suicide for months during the White Nights that we told you about last week. There was enough cyanide on site to kill every single one of them. That had been Jim Jones's exit strategy for quite some time. He always knew how. He just didn't know when.
Given all we know about Jim Jones and how tangential his relationship with reality had become, it's pretty likely that he never had any intention of going on the run after the revolutionary suicide. He wouldn't have been able to bear people knowing what a failure he was. And, like a family annihilator, as Saru said, he probably would have rationalised that it was kinder for him to die so his family wouldn't have to go on without him. As they gathered in the jungle like they had done so many times before, Jones told his apostles that their revolutionary suicide had finally arrived, and their deaths would be quick, painless, and serve the socialist cause. They had no reason to be afraid. And in the tapes, I think her name's Michelle, this woman says, "Is it too late for Russia?"
Oh, Michelle.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And what Jim Jones says in the death tape, the way he talks about death, is very Christian. Like, we've all seen that bit in Titanic where there's the priest and he's clinging to the propeller. And he says, and this is from Revelation 21:4, "And God shall wipe away all the tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death. Neither shall there be sorrow or crying, neither shall there be any more pain. The former world has passed away." Like, it's all there, you know? And actually, I've looked into it because, you know, obviously, recovering Catholic, that particular bit of Titanic has always had quite a big effect on me. He's real. It's a real priest, and he gave up his spot on a lifeboat because he was like, "I'm going to shepherd these people into the next life."
Wow.
I know, amazing.
Back in Jonestown, the greatest intentional loss of American lives in history began. The children were killed first, partly because they needed to be fed the poison, and partly because, once they were dead, their parents were less likely to feel the need to live. Hundreds of tumblers of Flav-Or-Aid laced with cyanide and Valium were handed out to the children. And the babies who couldn't quite hold a cup yet had it injected into their mouths. Now, cyanide has a bit of a reputation for being a quick and painless way to go because of its rise to fame as like the suicide pill of choice in World War II. But we now know that it is certainly neither of those things. Cyanide will take between 2 to 5 minutes to kill you. And during that time, you are fully conscious and unable to breathe until you enter cardiac arrest. So that meant that hundreds of parents had to watch their children's mouths fill with blood and vomit as Jones's voice poured over the PA system, telling them that they needed to die with respect.
After the last of the children were gone, the adults were next. Some of them were all too eager to end things, but we also know for a fact that not all of the adults in Jonestown willingly drank from the quite literally poisoned chalice. And we know that because some bodies of adults were found with abscesses where the concoction had been forcibly injected into them. And as his followers collapsed to the ground, convulsing in pain, Jones rambled over the jungle sound system. How very much I've tried to give you a good life. But in spite of all I've tried, a handful of our people, with their lies, have made our lives impossible. No man takes my life from me. I lay down my life. And then, most famously, he said, if we can't live in peace, let us die in peace. 909 men, women, and children who had wanted to change the world collapsed in unimaginable pain and died in the Guyanese jungle that day. Their final screams of agony are immortalized on cassette. Don't listen to it.
I have no interest in listening to that. And I'm just like, again, if this was in a film, you'd be like, how ridiculous.
Yes.
How fucking unbelievable. Oh my God. All I can think is I've got shivers thinking about that patch of jungle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just imagine being in that jungle at dark, knowing that 1,000 people died there. Oh my God. I'm upset.
The death tape stops after most of the children are dead. And I can't unhear those children's screams.
Has that bit of jungle become some sort of perverse, like...
You know it has.
True crime tourist pilgrim spot?
Yes, but it's only for the extraordinarily hardcore because it is so difficult to get to.
Sure. Eventually, the Guyanese army realised that something was very wrong and sent a group of helicopters to Jonestown. The smell of decomposing bodies on the floor of the jungle made it all the way up to the helicopters hovering hundreds of feet above. On the ground, the army discovered the 909 bodies scattered around the compound. Chillingly, some of the corpses had been lined up in rows, like someone had been tidying up in the middle of the massacre. Of the almost 1,000 bodies they found, 300 were never identified. Most of the unknown were children.
The temple's illustrious leader was discovered with a gunshot wound to the head. He had not Flav-Or-Aided himself to death, perhaps watching how quick and painless it was not 909 times. He couldn't bring himself to die that way. But he knew he couldn't leave the jungle alive. Like he had said to his followers so many times, the only way out of Jonestown was in a box. The last thing he said to the people he had broken so totally they willingly murdered their own children were, we committed an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the considerations of an inhumane world. And their sacrifice would echo through history forever. Temple member Eugene Smith left behind a note that read, "This is not what we wanted. At least we tried."
Now, people rarely talk about the singular chimp fatality at Jonestown.
I told you the monkeys would be back.
Yeah, because remember Jones's previous life as a door-to-door chimpanzee salesman? Well, a fully grown adult chimp called Mr. Muggs lived with Jim Jones in Jonestown. Jones told everybody that he had single-handedly rescued Mr. Muggs from scientific experimentation, but it's much more likely that he had just bought him from a pet shop. Mr. Muggs's body was found in the jungle commune too. He hadn't been forced to take cyanide either. He, like Jim Jones, had been shot in the head.
And we don't know whether Jones shot himself or whether someone shot him. We just will never know that.
But amidst all the death and destruction, we're happy to say that there were survivors too. Some had run off into the jungle and some had managed to slip away when Jones had instructed them to take suitcases containing $7.3 million to the nearest Soviet embassy.
And that's just proof that he knew what he was doing to these people. He absolutely could have fed them.
Yeah.
He could have made their lives a lot more comfortable, and he actively did not. And as we've been talking about, the Jonestown Massacre is so shocking in scale that it does feel undescribable. And how can you see that much death and believe it? It's because it's unquantifiable, it's unfathomable. Like I said in episode 1, to kill one person is an unthinkable act. It's 1,000.
It's like the line out of Harry Potter.
You're a wizard, Harry?
Yeah, the other one about when Harry asked Dumbledore, how many Horcruxes could there be out there? Could he have made more? I don't remember it word for word. I haven't read this book in a long time. But Dumbledore is like, how many more do there need to be to kill one person splits your soul? How many more? But obviously Tom Riddle had created lots more. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing.
And of course, there is an unavoidable question. Why on earth did those people with their children stay in Jonestown to the bitter revolutionary end? Lots of reasons. First off, they were in the middle of the jungle, no phones or money or passports, so there are physical barriers that play a role, but there were invisible ones too. The people in Jonestown were severely malnourished and they barely slept, which made decision-making and critical thinking difficult, if not impossible. By isolating his followers both geographically and ideologically, Jones was able to totally control the communication within his cult, not just between followers, but inside his dedicants' own heads.
Through the use of the Red Brigade, his people's forums, and the public beatings, Jones also managed to sow a culture of extreme fear. The members of the cult were terrified of being reported for dissent, so no one spoke to anyone about anything of substance. Being trapped, scared, and unable to communicate is, of course, a recipe for major anxiety and depression. Anxious, depressed people who are scared out of their minds are less likely to make elaborate escape plans. And they're also much more likely to exhibit drastically changed behaviours, and even to kill themselves, whether it's disguised as a revolutionary act or not. Humans are emotional and often behave irrationally. Hope is key to survival. Without it, we'd all cease to exist. And Jonestown was loaded with hope. The people there truly believed that they were building a better world. And if you didn't really believe with your whole being that a socialist utopia was possible, you probably wouldn't move to the jungle to build one.
And that brings us back to why cults go after intelligent, socially conscious, hard-working people. Because they're full of hopes and dreams. The followers of the People's Temple had attached such hope and emotion to Jonestown and the racial integration and the equality it represented, and they clung to it. They clung to that whisper of hope so hard that they poisoned their peers and their families because a drug addict in dark glasses told them to. They were broken people, shattered, and Jim Jones had done that to them. And we can explain how that mental pivot works on a deeper psychological level in theory. There's a paper called An Object Relations Approach to Cult Membership, and in that, Joseph D. Salande, I want to say, and David R. Perkins argue that being in a cult puts a human brain under so much pressure that people can exhibit borderline personality organization, which is one of the symptoms of BPD. And we have come across BPD before, borderline personality disorder, but let's give it a quick shakedown just in case. BPD can happen for a bunch of different reasons, some genetic and some environmental. Often, people with BPD have experienced traumatic childhoods. And according to the National Health Service and the charity Mind, those living with BPD feel emotions more strongly and uncontrollably sometimes than other people, and they exhibit disturbed patterns of thinking. Stuff like an intense fear of abandonment, extremely intense emotions that can change rapidly, no strong sense of identity, meaning that you become very different around different groups and can be easily influenced, feeling of emptiness, impulsive behavior that puts you and those around you in danger, self-harm, suicidal ideation, uncontrollable anger, extreme difficulty maintaining balanced relationships, and paranoia and disassociation. And, not everybody who's diagnosed with BPD will have all of those symptoms, but generally more than 7 of what I just said is enough for a diagnosis. And I cannot imagine living under those conditions.
Life with BPD is a life of extremes. And suicidal ideation is absolutely disturbed thinking. Evolutionarily speaking, we are hardwired to want to survive. And so to end our lives is not rational behavior. The point is, the repetitive activity, lack of sleep, and constant pressure to conform that cult members are often exposed to can actually cause their personality organization to break down to the point that their thinking resembles someone with borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, or antisocial personality disorder. Which makes perfect sense. Being indoctrinated into a cult is a traumatic experience, and everything about a cult is built to weaken our normal functioning egos, induce disassociation, and compromise critical thinking. Now, we're not saying that the people who lived and died in Jonestown that day spontaneously sprouted personality disorders. We're saying that the cult experience can weaken a healthy person with a well-regulated ego so much that it causes the self-destructive behavior that you may observe in someone who lives with a serious personality disorder.
So, as unbelievable as what the followers of Jim Jones did may seem, biologically and psychologically, it would appear that a lot of people would act in the same way had they been put through what happened in Jonestown. And I can only speak for myself here, but I'm one of them. My ego ain't that strong anyway. I absolutely would have succumbed to the pressure. So think about that next time you're looking at cult members and being like, how could they have been so stupid? Going through something like that is impossible for it not to change who you are.
Yeah. I mean, again, we've made several comparisons throughout this two-parter of Jim Jones and cult leaders in general to other types of offenders. So, domestic abusers, for one, that whole cutting you off from anybody else, isolating you from other family, from friends, from anybody else that would give you a way to change your frame of reference as to this relationship that you're in with this incredibly dangerous, toxic person. To think you could never join a cult is akin to thinking you could never be in an abusive relationship.
I completely agree.
It happens every day. It happens to intelligent people. It happens to people who are successful. It happens to people who have everything to live for. So I think it's just one of those things to be aware of, right? We're not saying go around, be paranoid of everybody you encounter. You might be joining a cult. But it's don't fall into that complacent way of thinking that this could never happen to you or to somebody you love. Because there really is nothing that's going to safeguard you from this other than critical thinking.
And they genuinely thought
yes,
they were going to change the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah. Tough old ride.
Jonestown survivor, Leslie Wagner Wilson, who has a book, slipped away the morning of the massacre with her 3-year-old son. And she walked 30 kilometers to the nearest town. And she backs us up on that as well, on our thoughts, feelings, concerns. Even though Leslie was there through the White Nights and the 6-day siege, she stayed almost until it was too late. She once wrote to Jim Jones saying that she was glad to have a dad and a father like you. So she was in, and she did believe in Jim Jones at some point. But she knew in her heart that she was in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing with the wrong people. But she explains that when you're in a group setting, it's so hard to break away. And this is a quote. Because everyone else is embracing and clapping and being joyous, you look at yourself and say, it must be me. And nearly 1,000 people were feeling exactly the same way, and they didn't try and run. And over 40 years after that day in the jungle, we're all still obsessed with Jonestown. And there's going to be a film. And Leonardo DiCaprio is going to be Jim Jones. And we have feelings. But it's not going to happen for a couple of years. So we're going to have to sit on those. Yeah, I know I keep using this word, but it's so unfathomable.
Truly, 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 truly. So yeah, that's it, guys. That is our two-parter on Jim Jones, and also the end of season, the year of 2024, here at Red Handed.
We don't do seasons, we're not allowed.
No, we're not
Jeff
allowed.
will sue us.
The year is the season.
Yes.
And this is the reason for the season. We now get a few weeks off, which will be lovely to give us a little break, recoup some energy, and we will be back in 2025 to kick true crime's butt. And we'll be starting off with a two-parter on Ellen Greenberg.
We certainly will.
Yeah.
I'm quite happy to have put Jonestown to bed because we've been dealing with it for a long time. And I'm free.
Free from the jungle.
Yes.
She's made it out, guys. So that's it. Have a beautiful Christmas, whatever you do. Have a wonderful new year. Just enjoy the people around you. Do all of those things. Give your dogs extra hugs and your cats, if that's what you got. And just, enjoy. And we'll see you all in January.
And don't you dare let the bastards grind you down. We will see you on the other side. Or else.
Happy Christmas.
Goodbye.